Good afternoon, and on behalf of AFAR, the American Federation for Aging Research, welcome to our webinar, The Potential of Geroscience, From Economic Gains to Social Returns and Ethical Concerns. AFAR is a 45-year-old organization that has been dedicated to our mission of supporting and advancing healthy aging through biomedical research. We've given a tremendous amount of funding to the brightest talent in the field to advance research in the basic biology of aging and geroscience. We also partner with other funders and organizations for programming and networks, including we're really proud to be leading 3 initiatives of the NIH, NIA. And we have a public education component like our webinars today, where our experts are sharing the solid science that's working to help us stay healthier longer. We're really honored today to have a guest moderator for this conversation. Brian Bergstein is the editor of the Ideas section of the Boston Globe. It's a section that asks, what if and why not? Brian, thank you for joining us and introducing our panelists.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm Brian Bergstein from the Boston Globe, which is where I'm coming to you from today. I'm very interested to hear from our panelists today. They're both fascinating, brilliant people, and so I want to get right into it. Before I introduce them, I just want to welcome everybody. Thanks to AFAR for having me, and thanks to all of you for being here. We're going to talk for about an hour, and we'll save the last half hour of this hour-long panel for audience Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to chime in the chat on the Zoom, and we'll take them on and incorporate them into the last half hour. But feel free to put a question in at any given time. So let's get into it. The first panelist I'm going to introduce is Raiany Romanni, who is a bioethicist and researcher, also here in Boston, and she's focused on human longevity. She is an AFAR scholar and grantee, and she's also the author of an upcoming book on the ethics and economics of human longevity. We also have Dr. Thomas Rando, who is the president of AFAR, director of the Broad Center of Regenerative Medicine and Stem Cell Biology at UCLA, and he's co-founder of the Stanford Center on Longevity. So, Tom, Raiany, thank you. It's really interesting to be here with you. I want to just start by coming at this at a very high level. Would each of you tell me how you got into studying human aging? What drew you into this field? Tom, why don't you go first?
Sure. So thank you, Brian, for hosting. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to AFAR for supporting this. So my entry into the aging research probably is twofold. Number one, I'm a clinical neurologist, so I've seen patients all my life who have age-related diseases. It's always been a fascination of why aging is such a big risk factor for these diseases of old age. But from a scientific point of view, my lab really has studied stem cell biology and tissue repair for many, many years. And some time ago, some decades ago, we just became interested in why is it that as we get older, we don't repair our tissues as well. A skin wound or a bone fracture, whatever it is, can we understand what goes wrong? And is there anything we can do about it? Are there ways to intervene, something I think we'll talk about today, that can slow or delay or even reverse some of the changes of the biology of aging in a way that would allow us to extend health span and in particular, repair our tissues and repair injuries when we're old, like we do when we're young. So that was sort of my main entry.
So Raiany, to be a bioethicist who looks at this question in particular, how did that come to you?
Yes, I think we tend to tell ourselves these novelistic stories about how we became interested in what, in many cases, we've always been interested in, when the answers are far more happenstance, including evolutionary happenstance. I think our interests, like everything else, are largely driven by our DNA and then by some environmental factors. But in my case, the story I've learned to tell is that I remember being maybe 9 or 10 and learning that Japan was going to go extinct as a country. Its population was aging rapidly and it may cease to exist. And I thought to myself, well, what are the plausible solutions to this problem? And the most obvious one to me seemed not to create more humans from scratch because we're not fungible tokens, but to keep existing ones alive and healthy for longer. So I was always obsessed with this question of demographic change and the possibility of some intrinsic human value and whether it's better from a moral economic standpoint to invest in new or existing humans. Yep.
So I know today we're going to get into the economics and the ethics of some of this research. Let's also just set up kind of what the big questions are driving this research. So I think we all know that life expectancy doubled, or one of you will set me straight on exactly what the growth was in the 20th century. But that health span, which is really, it seems like the key term here, the key goal here, health span did not increase by the same factor or the same margin. So, is that a good way to think about what the main goal is here? That this research, the state of the research now is really about increasing health span more than, say, life expectancy at the top line?
So I'll take a shot, Brian. So I mean, you're absolutely right. So the median lifespan or life expectancy over the past century has increased more than it had increased in all of human history combined before that. So it has been a remarkable century in terms of seeing children who are born living to a much higher average age than had ever happened before. And that has to do with lots of things aside from medicine and biology. It has to do with sanitation and food processing, many things that have been over the centuries problematic in terms of human health and human life. So yes, so we extended median lifespan enormously, but what we did not do nearly as much is change the fraction of that lifespan that people spend either disabled or with chronic disease. So, we know we sort of on average live very healthy lives through adulthood, and then sometime 70s, 80s, we start to lose function, quite obviously. And that is often accompanied by chronic disease and disability. And that can represent, 20% of a person's lifespan. So what the goal of a lot of biological research and a lot of what AFAR sponsors now is what you referred to, Brian, as health span. So that period of time, longer period of time of our full life that is spent healthy, vibrant, and active, and less time in that situation of some frailty and disability and chronic disease. Yeah, so another way to put it is we're not looking to have people live longer and longer and longer as much as we are focused on having that period of the normal human lifespan spent in relative health.
You say that there's roughly 20% of, on average, someone's lifespan you can expect to, have this pattern of morbidity, right? And that it might be possible to compress that. So what feels like a reasonable goal? I mean, what is it possible, say, to have someone live to be, say, 90 and really only be sick at the very end? Or we'll get into the sort of the economics of labor and continuing to work till, an advanced age. But how much can that 20% figure that you described be shrunk, you think?
It's a good question. I think it's not really answerable. We really don't know that. I think the best kind of example that we have to follow is those people who live very long lives, centenarians, super centenarians. The longest lived, the world record holder is a woman named Jeanne Calment, who died several decades ago, but lived to 122. And her life was really remarkable in the sense that she was riding a bike after the age of 100. And, she had her life was really very active and full right up until she died. And so, what's the limit? We don't know, but I think that our goal would be to have, really the period of disability measured in months or a few years as opposed to decades. So we haven't seen what that limit could be, but that is the goal of compressing that from decades to years to months.
Raiany, is there something it looks like you're on the
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we'll talk about the research I've done on the economics of longevity soon, but one major highlight in it that helps me answer this question is that we've been just vastly underinvesting in our existing older adults. From a GDP standpoint, adults aged 60 are more valuable to the economy if they're in good health than adults aged 20, because by our 60s, we've acquired a non-trivial amount of wisdom and knowledge, but this wisdom and knowledge will soon be outpaced by our cognitive and overall physical age-related decline. And it's stunning to me that the prevailing narrative out there in bioethics circles, as well as in family dinner parties, is that we should embrace this decline, when if we could keep our older adults healthy for longer, the social returns would be unparalleled. And so to me, that's a great starting point. If by the mid 2030s, within a decade, we could add a decade of healthy life to the average US 60-year-old, that would be tremendous in terms of lower medical costs and even, increased voluntary labor supply, which we can talk about more soon.
Yeah, and I do want to get into that, and will soon. I just, without getting too deep into the weeds on the science, I do think it's interesting for uh, people on the call to understand, what are some of the biggest new ideas, the things that are most exciting, and then also what are still some of the biggest hurdles, to this question of increasing health span? Like what are some of the things that we know now maybe about potentially increasing health span? Um, that we have learned in the last few years that maybe we didn't know 15, 20 years ago, let's say.
So again, I'll take a crack.
Yeah.
Again, there are a lot of interesting and exciting areas of aging research. It really is still a very young field. And so, every year, every couple of years, there's new directions and new ideas put forth. I mean, I think what's really interesting that has increased the attention of the scientific community is just this idea of aging as a risk factor. That is, why is it that we're much more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular disease when we're 60 as opposed to when we're 40 or when we're 20. So there's something about aging itself that creates this risk. And can we understand what that is from a biological point of view? And most of the work that we have and most of the understanding comes from studies of animals. So laboratory animals where things that are the animals like mice or worms or flies might be treated with extends their health span, not only their lifespan. So we begin to understand the biology of aging itself, not just the biology of cancer or the biology of cardiovascular disease, but the biology of aging. And if we can target that, with drugs or with diet, whatever it is, we have the potential to slow or arrest or slow or delay the aging process. And the benefit of that is the delay of all of the age-related diseases combined. So we're not, the historical approach of treatments of diseases of aging has often been called, the whack-a-mole approach. So you get one disease, you treat it. You get another one, you treat it. But what if, and this is, I think, a really compelling concept, what if you could target the biggest risk factor for all of those diseases, and then at the same time delay or reduce the onset, the frequency, or the burden of those diseases? So I think conceptually that's been an important shift in the field, and really exciting to think about translating what we've learned in the laboratory into patients, into humans, not even patients, just people as they age.
It's interesting that you say this is a very young field. I know that's no pun intended, but that is a sort of an interesting concept. Why is aging research so young and so new? I mean, what is I know you talked about the conceptual breakthrough that was required to see aging as the sort of like holistic driver behind all these diseases that have traditionally been studied and thus treated as one-offs. But when I spoke to you earlier, both you and Raiany have talked about this really interesting work that seems rather recent to actually even try to figure out if there is something like a biological clock that can provide some kind of like objective measurement on how people are aging. Can you just talk a little bit, one of you talk a little bit about that as a concept? How new is that research to even figure out where someone sort of stands in their aging process?
Sure. So the kind of general field you're referring to is often called epigenetic clocks or aging clocks more generally. And that is really Again, there's a lot of there are companies out there that if you send them some saliva or some blood, they will tell you, quote, what your biological age is. What does that mean? I mean, we all know people who look much younger than their chronological age or look much older. And people do get, frail early or later in life. Is that really something separate from your chronological age? It seems to be. You could be 60, but have the physiology of a 50-year-old or a 70-year-old. So the goal of these clocks is to try to understand that, is try to measure that. Can you actually take a sample from a person and tell them, are you a fast ager or a slow ager? And then ideally, is there anything you can do about it? But I think the concept you're raising, Brian, is, really, can we measure this process that is different from our birthday? We just know how many years we've been around, but can we measure something that tells us about our rate of aging? And that's where these clocks come in, that have been, it's been a very exciting field. It's only, a little more than a decade old. But there's a huge interest in using those. And maybe we'll talk about this even for clinical trials to, find out, is this drug, for example, working to slow or accelerate? We don't want to accelerate, but the rate of aging. So I think that clock concept is definitely a new and exciting area.
I'll add to this that up until very recently, the literature had conflated health with biological youth. So we used to think of health span as almost equivalent with being young, but really, if you think about it from a disease standpoint, it's far better to be a chain smoking 30-year-old than it is to be an athlete at 80. And so, being told that you're healthy for your age when you're 80 might just mean you have two chronic diseases, which is not a great place to be in, right? So we want to kind of divorce those two concepts and really understand, what does biological youth mean? And could we find biomarkers that are predictive and reliable, that could allow us to run a rigorous clinical trial? That would be, maybe the biggest win possible for the field.
So just to build on what you each have said just a little bit, we're about to get, into some of this research that you've done on the economics of increased investment in anti-aging research or into, increasing health span. Just so everyone has a sense of what that would entail, what that money would be spent on. I mean, what are some of the biggest unsolved problems? Tom, you talked a little bit about this, but what are the biggest hurdles in the field or the biggest unsolved problems? Like, if for the rest of this meeting, we're talking about, more money spent would do X, Y, and Z. What are those kinds of fundamental questions that like most urgently need answering with research?
So, one thing that Randy just mentioned, of course, is this field called biomarkers, and that is the clocks are part of that. But the issue is, can you enroll? So if we're going to advance the therapeutics aspect of, can we promote health span therapeutically, whatever that is, whether it's by drugs or even by lifestyle changes, how do we measure it? And the clocks are part of that, but there are a lot of other ways that investigators around the world are looking at in terms of, what do we measure? What can you measure in the blood, for example, or in the skin, or wherever, that tells you something about the state of health or the state of aging. So biomarker, we don't have that. So if you were to go to the Food and Drug Administration and say, I want to conduct a clinical trial because I have this great drug and I think it slows aging because it works really great in mice and maybe in dogs, and I want to test it in humans, the FDA is going to say, okay, you can't do a clinical trial for 50 years because no one can afford that. You're going to do it for 2 or 3 years. What are you going to measure? How are you going to know if it's working? So we just don't have that yet. There's a conference going on in Boston right now on biomarkers, and that's really we've been having these conferences for many, many years, and I'm sure we'll have more, but it's a field that is refining, and will be a consensus on that will change the field for sure, because it'll advance us from planning these trials to actually doing them. So I think that's a really important hurdle in terms of how we go from where we are in the research to where we go applying this in populations.
So, Raiany, you just did a lot of research into the potential payoff of more investment in this field. And I'm fortunate that you're going to be writing about it upcoming in the Boston Globe Ideas section. Looking forward to publishing that very soon. But why don't you tell us what it is you were looking for, what you found? This research, as I understand it, took 2 years. So why don't you give us some insight into what you were studying?
Yeah, so I did spend the last 24 months working with a team of economists from the Abundance Institute, from Harvard, from the University of Southern Carolina, and we basically built a simulation tool with returns on investment for specific R&D advancements in aging science. So we looked, for instance, at the social and economic value of slowing brain aging relative to slowing reproductive aging. And the question we wanted to answer was, how many lives could we save or create, and how many dollars could we add to the US economy from a GDP standpoint? So to date, there had been no study conducted using gross domestic product as a methodology. The previous study had used this methodology called value of statistical life. And there you basically, there are two ways to go about this. You could essentially say that a human life is worth about 15 million and then backtrack from it and say, if you add 1 year of healthy life to the average person in the US population, that would be worth about 200,000. Or you could look at gross domestic product, which comes with its own sets of problems because you're essentially reducing human value to human productivity, but it does help us get a sense of the direct economic growth that would result from slowing biological aging. And using GDP, the interesting finding is that if you slow reproductive aging and as a result you get higher birth rates, you are actually slowing economic growth in the short term because newborns don't work. They temporarily remove their parents from the workforce. And then in the long run, they very predictably grow biologically old and chronically ill. So from a purely economic standpoint, slowing reproductive aging only makes sense in the short term if you also see it as an investment in older adults who are often at the peak of their career, right? Because you're also reducing the rates of menopause, and there's a clear correlation between menopause and lower labor productivity that has gone understudied for decades, but now we're seeing that there's some clear effects. And we basically cited a paper by Conti et al. That suggests if menopause goes untreated, it essentially you reduce labor productivity by about at least 1% a year, and that has tremendous economic impacts in aggregate terms. So we found that the most direct returns on investment would be from slowing brain aging because you're investing in humans with fully grown brains, often at the peak of their career, right? Most of us peak income-wise around age 58, and then very predictably our income falls or we stop working primarily as a result of how we age.
So, okay, so let's just drill down on that a little bit. So it's not to say that other research into other these other domains aren't valuable, but it sounds like what you're saying is the ROI of research into increasing health span of older adults is exceptionally valuable. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Like, I mean, how much higher, let's say, does it seem from your simulation and your this analysis? How much higher is the ROI seem to be of more funding in longevity, health span research, right, than these other domains?
Yeah, so for instance, if you eradicate all cancers, you would add about 2 years to the average life in the US. And that is because the median age of a cancer diagnosis is 66. So those would-be cancer patients would die of, a heart attack or a broken hip soon after. So the idea here is that if you prevent age-related decline, you wouldn't be targeting a single disease. You would be targeting the host of diseases that typically follow from biological aging. And we did model the economic value of eradicating aging versus the economic value of, not eradicating aging, of eradicating cancer versus the economic value of slowing aging by 5 years. Because we wanted to consider what is likely in the coming decade. So the most ambitious question we asked was, what if people aged 40 and older in the US behave like people 5 years younger in the economy and in hospital settings, except they can still retire at age 65? So we assume no shift in the age of retirement. And the returns from slowing biological aging are about 2 trillion per year, which adds up to about $105 trillion over several decades. 2 trillion per year is roughly the equivalent of adding a Canada-sized economy to the US every year, just for reference. And in the long run, we compared it to a study by Murphy and Topel from the University of Chicago. They found that if we could eradicate cancers, that would be worth about 80 trillion to the US economy. So, slowing aging by 5 years would be worth more to the economy than eradicating all cancers.
Now, this idea of looking at the value to the economy is interesting on its own right, but it also seems especially timely in light of what is seeming to be greater attention on the declining birth rate, because that has these sort of stark economic implications that people are starting to talk about. I think for a long time, people didn't really even realize that birth rate was dropping low enough that the population could drop. Immigration levels are also dropping. So another interesting part of your analysis is that if you're trying to get more economic output out of a society that is aging or the population is dropping, you have this interesting insight about how to square this, the ROI on investing in aging research versus just having, producing more babies to support the entitlement programs of the future, right? To be the future workforce. How do you think about that relative to like this talk about, pronatalist movements and things like that?
Yeah, so the fascinating thing about slowing aging is that it would be essentially like importing highly experienced workers from a highly developed country, namely the United States. And what I love about GDP and the model we use, co-developed by my co-authors, Jason DeBecker and Richard Evans, is that it doesn't undervalue the wisdom and knowledge we've accumulated by our 50s. So, the highest ROI we can get is precisely in our late 50s when we are mostly, at the peak of our career. And pronatalism, I think it's an incomplete solution to this problem. But, from an economic standpoint, the new humans in question would be infinitely better off, but the remainder of the population would be very slightly worse off by just increasing birth rates, right? So the only way that slowing reproductive aging results in positive GDP per capita results is if we can, think of it as investments in older adults who are suffering from menopause, for instance, because otherwise we get negative returns in the short run. In the first 3 decades, which is non-trivial, right? If you don't think we have 3 decades laying around for national competitiveness, then you probably shouldn't think that, pronatalism is going to solve it all.
I mean, there's another way of saying this, that if you were Congress trying to figure out how to allocate money, whether it was to stimulating the birth rate or throwing a lot more money into aging research, it sounds like what you're arguing is the aging research has a better payoff because you could, as you say, keep people working longer, already existing people, rather than waiting 18 to 20 years for some baby boom to start to pay off. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it?
It is, and I would add that they're not mutually exclusive, right? Because biology is not the primary or only reason why people choose not to have kids today, but it's an important reason. We know that IVF has increased birth rates by about 5% in Australia, which is the best documented country. 5% is a non-trivial increase in birth rates. And then on top of it, you're helping people not suffer from conditions like menopause, which is similarly important, right? We increasingly understand menopause as having some sort of important correlation, though it's understudied with diseases like Alzheimer's and cancer.
So this is for either of you, really. How underfunded is this field, really? I mean, relative to what you think is necessary. I don't expect you to have a number, but just even like a ballpark sense of, we've talked about aging research being a kind of a young field. Rainy's analyzed, the economic effects that could accrue from investing more, but I mean, how much more? How much does this field feel underfunded to each of you?
I guess it's like you say, Brian, it's hard to answer that question because we always feel underfunded. Everybody wants more funding for what they work on. I think so I would say vastly, that's where I would start in the sense that, Congress, and I understand how people come at this because they understand cancer, they understand Alzheimer's disease, they see it in their families. They don't understand aging in the same way. They don't think of it in the same way. But it really is about preventive medicine. It really is. And it really starts with how do we take care of our bodies when we're young so that as we get older, we are better, we're more robust in avoiding these age-related diseases. But it's hard to assess that. We don't have good examples to look at and say, if we did this, we would, just what we were saying, we would extend health span by this much or that much and what it would do. So I think it's a little bit more complicated to understand the investment that is being made compared to saying, let's invest in treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Sounds like a no-brainer. Meaning, if we cured that, that would be a great advance for humanity. But it's not as impactful as slowing the rate of aging. But I just don't think we have good examples to point to for people to understand why that's so important. So I think it's an education issue for the public, for the leadership, for thought leaders as to why this is important and exactly kind of not only in terms of health, but economics. I mean, we spend most of our money either taking care of people who are old and sick or paying Social Security. I mean, you can imagine a society in which people live and are happy and are working and are healthy much later in life. It just eases both of those huge burdens of both retirement payments as well as Medicare payments. Now, there are socioeconomic and there are other factors where this may not be evenly distributed across society, and those are critical. So it's not simply that we want everybody to benefit, not just the people who are already wealthy and healthy. So I think there are important socioeconomic factors in deciding how to invest, but I think this investment in preventive medicine as a way of extending health span is what's underfunded, and it's a challenge to kind of do that education as to why that's so important.
Well, so we're in a period of declining national support for a lot of fields of science. And a skeptic may say, hey, look, why do we really need to invest so much more in all of these potential interventions in health span when, after all, we know probably that some of the biggest answers, involve lifestyle, be connected to a community, exercise, don't smoke, drink very little, those kinds of things, right? Someone might say, hey, look, and there's also this robust kind of market and, new ideas emerging. There's a million podcasts about longevity and health optimization. Like, there's a lot of noise out there and a lot of probably pre-existing perceptions. I'd just be curious if either of you could kind of take that on and make the case that, what might look like progress in this field is maybe an illusion or insufficient. What do either of you make of that?
Go ahead, Rin.
Yeah, so I'll say that the reason why giant tortoises can live to be 200 and never get cancer isn't because of their daily step count, right? So our goal here isn't merely to imitate something like what exercise could do, because no matter how much you exercise, at age 80, you will most likely have some form of mild or advanced cognitive impairment. You're going to have, a couple chronic diseases, and you're very soon going to die. That is objectively a fact for human beings, right? That's why I think it is important to divorce the idea of biological youth from merely, calling someone healthy, because being healthy for your age isn't an ideal goal. I think we really want to understand what it means to be biologically youthful and to suffer from the diseases of aging at the same rate as someone who's 60 when you're, chronologically 80.
Um, there's also this idea too, I think that you both have mentioned to me that I think is really interesting about establishing actually aging as a field for new talent to go into. Do you feel like that isn't yet sort of a draw? Is there still that model of people chasing like a single mechanism or a single disease, or is that some of the best researchers in biomedicine? Is that where they're still going? How do you think about that question?
I mean, I think, again, the fields of medicine is very broad, and there are a lot of exciting fields that people go into. Aging is a small field. And so I think just kind of inspiring young people to go into this is really important. And I think when people learn about it and read about it, they get excited. So again, we need to kind of expand the field and bring in the best and brightest minds. I mean, I think, Brian, what you referred to, kind of a minute ago about the noise, I think, that is critical. And there is so much noise, and it is a field that lends itself to unfounded claims, and that's everywhere. I mean, every claim of a supplement that will do this or do that is based on perhaps some biology, but not actually tested in humans. So the economy that goes into, longevity supplements, longevity interventions is enormous, and yet very little of it is based on hard science. So that's the job of AFAR and researchers to kind of educate the public as much as possible as to what's real and what's not. And there's a lot of noise. I mean, it just everybody wants to live healthier, and so if you read about this as an advertisement for this, it's enticing. So I think there's that noise part, but I think still, as we have students come through and learn about this, they get excited when they see the potential from the research. And it's just, I think, our job to kind of continue to inspire, to draw people into the field.
All right, I'm going to start taking picking up some questions that have come in from the audience. And the first one actually builds on something you just said and mentioned earlier, which is this notion of how you actually rigorously test some of the hypotheses around treating aging and increasing health span in this holistic way. Is it, as far as both of you can tell, necessary for research to progress, for the clinical trials to have benchmarks that can be actually measurable? Is it absolutely necessary for aging to be classified and treated as a disease? Because there's obviously the understandable school of thought is that, look, aging is a natural biological process. How could you treat it as a disease? Doesn't that change our definition of disease? But anyway, are you sure that aging should be considered a disease for the purposes of doing this research? And then what are the societal, potential societal implications of that?
I mean, I would say that it gets to be some semantics as what we call a disease and what we call aging for sure. But aging, even if we don't classify it as a disease, which I tend not to, for the very reason you said, Brian, it's universal. It's not what we consider historically to consider a disease, which has a specific mechanism, a specific tissues. It happens to everybody. Regardless, it still can be considered an outcome. That is, from the point of view of doing a trial, we don't have to call it a disease. We could just say, here's a change that we want to measure because we think we can do something about this loss of function. And if we think about diseases of aging, there were historically there were many things that happened to humans, like bone loss and muscle loss, that were never considered diseases. They were just considered aging. But as we are able to measure things and then treat them, like osteoporosis, that then becomes a disease. So we start peeling off things that have been natural aging, calling them diseases over time, and that's going to continue. So I think we can get sort of hung up in the aging versus disease, is aging a disease or not? But I think it certainly should be considered an outcome for a trial, right? That is, you don't have to call it a disease to say, let's measure it, let's test it, and let's see if there's an intervention that can do something about it. I think we should sort of get away from the debate about whether it's a disease or not, and just focus on what we can measure and how we can change things.
Yeah, I fully agree with Tom.
Another question that came in picked up on the trillion-dollar numbers in your research, Raiany. That's obviously looking at this national population economic standpoint, the standpoint of increasing, the health on this massive scale of so many people. The audience member points out, though, that most clinical research on anything longevity related is performed at a smaller scale and usually specialty specific, as the questioner puts it. And this member of the audience wants to know, how can clinician scientists think about essentially building a broader case, making a sort of actually like a business case for their work?
Yeah, that is a good point. So in our study, we use gross domestic product, which is an aggregate sum, and then we looked at GDP per capita results to look at how this could affect the average US person. But we have not modeled what would one specific clinical trial afford to one specific pharmaceutical company, let's say. And that is where market failures come in, right? It's what creates the rationale for public investments rather than leaving it all up for private markets to solve. So we wanted to, our primary audience here was policymakers as opposed to, the one health insurance company who could benefit from it. And it is kind of the perfect tragedy of the commons, right? Because we would all benefit from longer, healthier lives in the long run, but no single insurer has the incentives to do this by themselves, to shoulder the costs of investments in the short term. But it's an interesting question, and it's one that I think warrants further study. It's one that I and the team of economists I've worked with over the past few years want to take up as well.
Are there other market failures you see that stand out to you that would also call for more kind of nationally directed, more, thoughtfully directed research?
Yeah, I think there's this notion that pharmaceutical companies are evil or don't want to extend our healthy lifespan. It's what Peter Koczynski calls the Massachusetts paradox, right? We're the most life-saving industry on earth, and yet we are the ones with maybe the worst reputation out there. And I think the fact that we don't yet have excellent human relevant results in aging science is also just a function of how disease is just very often far easier to measure than health, right? Health span is this fuzzy, messy concept that nobody quite knows how to measure. So the counterfactual of what would happen to a patient if you just left them alone is kind of unknowable, right? It's much easier to say, extend the unhealthy lifespan of a cancer patient by 3 months, often at the end, would be end of their lives, than it is to get in the messy space of extending healthy lifespan by 10 years, even though it would make for the most profitable life sciences company of all time if somebody shouldered the cost of investment. But we risk always being, 2 to 3 drug cycles away, 10 to 15 years away from, living in a future where human aging is druggable.
Brian, I would just add to that, one of the, I think, encouraging aspects in the market is the increase in number of companies that are founded with the goal of treating aging. I mean, that was 20 years ago unheard of. In fact, I remember, we had some data from the early 2000s that was very promising that, this process of aging is malleable. You could potentially slow it, you could potentially even reverse it. And it was very exciting and, from a scientific point of view. And I remember going to some of the pharmaceutical companies around the Bay Area and not being laughed out of the room, but being told that will never happen. At the time, because the argument was this, and it's sort of, it makes sense. They said anything that you are going to give to healthy people because of some benefit later in life has to be as safe as water. That was the argument. That was the phrase. And that was throughout the pharmaceutical industry. That has changed. So now people are beginning to say, I mean, even drugs that we take now, statins and so forth, people take them for life. They treat a disease, but they really seem to have very long-term benefits that, like these drugs like metformin, maybe people could take them early in life and have long-term benefits. So I think that mindset that we can't even think about treating aging has changed dramatically and has encouraged huge investment in startups, even in big companies that are starting to look at aging as a target.
So building on what you just said, an audience member had a question that I wish I had asked when you earlier said that whether you consider aging a disease or not is semantics to some extent, because you could consider it an outcome to measure in a clinical trial. Does the FDA accept that? Does the FDA say you
Not
can?
yet. No, again, in their defense, they don't accept it because they don't see the field has having established outcome measures, biomarkers. So the FDA says, come back when you have something to measure that you all agree upon. And that will be the game changer for the FDA. I think that if there becomes sort of a consensus that we can measure something over the course of a couple of years that really gets this fundamental biology of aging and that has these implications for health, the FDA will, I'm sure they'll start to listen. And they're listening now, but they're basically saying you need to have better measures for us to know that these trials are going to be worth doing.
And I assume no regulators in any other country have decided any differently, right?
To my knowledge, I mean, I know the EMA in Europe is in the same. And again, I'm not sure about all over the world, but certainly Europe and the US are very aligned on this.
One thing we have not talked about yet here is AI and whether there's any kind of expectation on either of your parts that it's going to dramatically increase the rate of progress in the field. You could imagine biomarker discovery. An audience member who posed this question mentioned not only the use of AI in the biomedical, like at the cellular, protein level, but even to model ethical decision making, maybe about how these treatments get rolled out. So that's just interesting. How do you think about the potential role of AI as a spur to this kind of research? That's, not just theoretically, but is it even starting to happen?
So, Raiany, why don't you take the ethical side if you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first I would just say that there are vast amounts of data in biobanks, like the Million Veterans Program, for instance, in the US. They, as the name implies, they have 1 million veterans enrolled, half of whom are over the age of 65, and they have extensive medical data on these individuals. So I do think that using AI for cases where we do have data that could allow us to get, to predictive biomarkers would be, it's very likely that it will result in something, even if there's no novelty coming out of large language models. I think we will arrive at some kind of just, analysis that will be fruitful. And then from an ethical standpoint, I tend to be a moral universalist, which means I think, some things are universally, objectively better than others. And I do think that AI will be an immensely helpful tool to help us arrive at, how do we quantify the best possible social returns on investment for specific population groups. I think that will be helpful. And I honestly, I do not see any future where a preventative therapeutic could be bad for vulnerable populations. I think if anything, they will benefit the most from, not getting diagnosed with cancer, not getting diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
And if I could just add to what Raiany said. So I think, when the public hears AI, I'm not sure what in general people think, but probably there's a lot of thinking it's generative AI and, what people are using ChatGPT for. But really, in what Raiany mentioned, there's data, there's lots and lots and lots of big data, and it takes machine learning and AI algorithms to process this. And we were just actually this morning having a meeting of an AFAR subgroup to talk about actually this, how do we predict who's going to respond and who's not going to respond to any drug, for example. And that's something that will take these complex algorithms to sort through where, for example, let's say we have a drug that is beneficial to a group of people in terms of extending health span, but not to another group. And that's certainly possible. We see that in experimental animals. We need to know that, and we can't do that one trial at a time. That needs to be, analyzed from these huge data sets. And I was actually, I worked at the VA for early in my career. I was part of this Million Vet program. And that was a game changer because that was, huge amount of genomic data, but also importantly, a huge medical record associated with all these patients. And that's been what's challenging. So we have all this information. That is hard to, impossible for humans to process. So it really is the analysis of big data that is really going to be, very impactful, even in the very short term, in terms of as we move forward in thinking about these health span interventions and how do we roll this out equitably and across the population.
Yeah, now just said that even just understanding what effects some biomarker has on, looking at female populations versus male populations, that's going to be something that AI is going to enable us to do that we just haven't been able to do so far. So I see just mostly benefits. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I could talk to you both about this all day, but we do need to wrap up. So I'm going to actually make this the last question. And it would be great if each of you could take it on, which is, help us think about what success or failure looks like in this field. If we were to meet again for this conversation, like 5, 10, 15 years from now, like where would you hope we would be? Implied in that is it would be bad if we weren't where you hope to be, but where would you hope we are, say, 10, 15 years from now, advancing this field?
I'll start with the unfortunate scenario. It would be, 10, 15 years go by and we have more unproven supplements and more drugs that extend our unhealthy lifespan by a handful of months. And then the hopeful scenario is we've run a clinical trial with aging as an endpoint, and we've firmly established that we can target the biology of aging directly, and we have, a series of companies and investors running more trials. That would be an exciting future.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. To me, a failure would be we have this webinar in 10 years and we're asking the same questions. We're saying we still need biomarkers. And, that would be to me, if not a failure, a disappointment for sure, that we really have not crossed some of these key thresholds. So that would be one. And the other would be that we're still kind of chasing down the very same paths. This, like I said, it's a young field. There's a lot of opportunity. And so my hope and expectation is that this field will expand and we will see exciting new areas of research that will give us new insights into how we would intervene. And even as we've talked a little bit, not only drugs, which is kind of the industrial approach, but how lifestyle changes really make this difference and how we kind of roll that out in the population. So I know that people are not inclined to change their behavior easily. They know they should save more for retirement. They know they shouldn't smoke. They know they should get more exercise. These things have been pretty flat for a long time, despite a lot of information. So, the hope is that with more information and education and people really believing in the benefits of these approaches, that we will see increasing health span, both through research, but also through kind of public policy.
I just want to sneak in one follow-up to what you just said. Do you think it's unlikely that there is going to be one supplement that kind of does it all, that there's going to be a range of treatments? Like that's got to be does that seem like the most likely outcome here?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and again, this is, I think, well grounded in laboratory research that you take even one strain of mice and another strain of mice, which are very similar compared to kind of the vast genetic diversity of humans, and one treatment works in one strain and not another. So almost certain, I will go out and say certainly, I'll go out on a limb that there will not be one magic bullet, and there will be, more this kind of tailored medicine and personalized medicine that will be tailored to a person's, genetic background and their lifestyle and their diet that is going to be quite varied, and it's not going to be one size fits all.
All right. Well, that sounds like a good note to end on.
Okay.
Thank you both. Thanks to AFAR for having me. AFAR is going to share a recording on their website and through email and social media. So there should be multiple ways for you to revisit or share this recording. I want to thank all of you for being here. And again, thanks to Tom and Raiany for joining me and AFAR for inviting me. Thanks, everybody. I wish you all good afternoon.